we do is good and true.
Welcome to Every Church a Peace Church, a program that promotes the belief that the church could turn the world towards peace if the church lived and taught as Jesus lived and taught. My name is Don Edwards, and I welcome you back to another exciting program of Every Church a Peace Church. We have a wonderful prophetic guest that I know you will be interested in staying tuned and listening to. Dr. Cornel West is my guest today. Dr. West is one of those few celebrity intellectuals. He's a frequent face, a frequent guest on many of the national televised interview programs, such as most recently Tavis Smiley, Bill Maher's Real Time on HBO, Sean Hannity's program, and Bill O'Reilly's program. He's the author of the best-selling book, Race Matters, which is a book about the overarching issue of race and racism in America. And now there's a sequel to Race Matters with a new book, a new bestseller called Democracy Matters, Winning the Fight Against Imperialism. A book that examines the fragility of the democratic experience here in in America, especially since September 11th, and particularly in light of the current political administration. Dr. Cornel West is currently professor of religion at Princeton University. He's a former professor at Harvard, taught at Yale, Union Theological Seminary. He's an author, orator supreme. He's a critical thinker, peacemaker, devoted Christian in the path that was practiced by our prophet Jesus, a path of compassion, love your neighbor, to walk humbly and to do justice. And to the limit of our 30 minutes, we will talk about the critical issues that Cornel discusses in Democracy Matters, the current resurgence of American imperialism, and in particular, one of the chapters in the book we want to focus on, and that chapter reads, The Crisis of Christian Identity in America. Welcome, Dr. West, to Every Church a Peace Church.
It's a blessing
You honor me
to be here on the show, and already congratulations to you for the force for good that you and this show
Well, thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Very much.
And I thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be here to share your passion, your love for this country, for democracy, for Christianity. And I know we're going to have an exciting program for the next 30 minutes. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to pile it on a little bit with some additional comments that some wonderful people have said about you. Marion Wright Edelman refers to you as one of the most authentic, brilliant, prophetic, and healing voices in America. Newsweek writes, Cornel West is an eloquent prophet with attitude. PWA. I know you like that, prophet with attitude. Your friend and colleague, Professor Henry Gates, calls you our Black Jeremiah. And if truth-telling is the stuff of prophets, I join with them to say that this book and your work, both in Race Matters and Democracy Matters, tells the truth about the American experience, tells the truth about American democracy, and about the citizenry participation that either supports or degrades that democracy. So I'm sure you'll accept the mantle of being a prophet. I'm glad to have a prophet on this program. We've had many prophets on this program.
You've had some towering one. I mean, I would say I was just a small moment in the prophetic tradition itself, because that tradition itself is so rich. And I think there's a difference between being one voice within a long prophetic tradition than being just an isolated prophet without being connected to what came before.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, and your book and your work always makes the connections. And that's one of the interesting parts of your critique, is it always goes into the past and speaks to the future.
Absolutely.
Let me begin our dialogue with this question, Cornel. Why did you write Democracy Matters. What was it that you wanted to say about our American experience in democracy?
Yeah, I think I wrote it because I'm just so frightened at this particular historical moment. I think we're at a fork in the road. And I think it's very important that the voices of those towering prophetic and Socratic figures be heard. And what I meant in part is to try to understand that there constitute a cloud of witnesses that have been trying to bring critique to American democracy in the name of democratic ideals, because they're keeping track of anti-democratic dogmas operating in the democracy. Because every democracy is unfinished. Every democracy is incomplete. And it's unfinished and incomplete in part because there's always anti-democratic dogmas and elements operating within the democracy that need to be exposed, laid bare, and overcome. So that, for example, in race matters, I was talking about the dogma of white supremacy that promotes the arrested development of American democracy, because here you got this precious democratic experiment called the USA, and you got this dogma of white supremacy at the very center of it, slavery. And same is true with male supremacy, same is true with national arrogance, same is true with losing sight of the humanity of disabled or physically challenged brothers and sisters, or gay brothers or lesbian sisters, or whatever, you see. And so race matters said, I'm going to focus on this one particular dogma, white supremacy, and then make the connections to wealth inequality and so on. Whereas democracy matters said, well, we've got some broader ones, free market fundamentalism, the fetishizing of the market, making the market an idol. You would think all persons who come out of the legacies of Jerusalem, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, recognize that any form of idolatry needs to be radically called into question. And the same is true with the aggressive militarism and the escalating authoritarianism. All of these dogmas that actually constitute a major threat to this very fragile, I love the way you put that, the fragility, the caducity, which is the almost frailty at times of a democracy. And look at Russia right now. They just canceled democracy. I mean, that sheds, all Democrats ought to shed tears. They just canceled in the name of what? Fighting terrorism. Right. You say, my God, now Russia has a very, very underdeveloped democratic tradition. It's got a strong authoritarian tradition, even though they got Anton Chekhov, who's one of the great democratic artists and intellectuals of modernity. But he couldn't get a democratic experiment off the ground. And when they finally tried to get it off the ground, now it's squelched. America's got a rich democratic tradition, even as it's had to deal with its own imperial strand, vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, Mexican peoples, and of course then the enslavement of African peoples, subordination of working peoples, and so on. But we've got so many fellow citizens who recognize that we have a democratic tradition we can build on. Yes. And I think actually black people have a disproportionate role to play, because historically black people have. Not because we're better than anybody, but rather because our role, our position in the American democracy always allows us to keep track of the hypocrisy, the mendacity, the shortcomings, the limitations of that democracy, even given the deep commitment we have to democratic ideal.
And the element of forgiveness as part of the African American experience, even despite being oppressed by the hypocrisy of democracy, we've been able to forgive, and I think that's all part of the. And
that's so crucial. I mean, I talk here about 9/11, in which all Americans feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. Whereas that's actually been the condition of black people in America from the very beginning. To be black in America is to feel unsafe, unprotected, subject to random violence, and hated. Yeah. So now what I call the niggerization of America. Now the whole nation's niggerized. Will their response to niggerization, terror coming at them, be the same? And how will it measure up against black people's response to terror? We think of Emmett Till's mother when she stepped to the lectern and had to say to the world with her own baby, victim of American terror, what did she say? I don't have a minute to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. Now, this is a level of moral maturity and spiritual strength grounded in her Christian faith. Martin King the same way, when he had to speak to the 4 young precious girls in Birmingham. Speak to their parents, their tears flowing. What do you say, Brother Martin? What are you going to say? Somehow we got to muster the courage to fight terror with the armament of love and justice. Well, see, he's rooted in his Christian faith. This is a very high standard.
Yes.
Very high standard. We look at Bush administration and others responding to niggerization, terror after 9/11. Do they meet that standard of justice, or is it revenge? Do they meet the standard of forgiveness, or is it machismo identity, hunt them down like cockroaches, echoes of, Ahab?
There's not even the response of self-examination.
No self-criticism, no self-scrutiny, no sense that one can make a mistake, no sense that you can separate a particular slice of persons from a larger group, so that, for example, Emmett Till's mother is not saying something must be wrong with all white brothers and sisters just because we got some sick white brothers and sisters in Mississippi. She can make a distinction. You see, Martin's not saying that we ought to declare war on white people in Birmingham, because he knew that those particular sick white brothers who were terrorists and killed those young girls, they didn't speak for the whole white community. There was this sense of acknowledging the difference. And of course, if the dominant black response to America was the response of the Bush administration to 9/11, there had been a civil war in America every generation. The American democratic experiment would not exist.
Right.
You see, so there's something to be said for a nation that now has the blues turning to learn from a blues people who's been in the midst of the nation for over 243 years now.
So the theme of your book, Democracy Matters, it calls for the rise of prophetic voices.
Yes.
The prophetic voice to counteract, to contest the rise of American imperialism and what you often refer to as nihilism in the book. The loss of values that speak to some of the traditions that are part of America, democratic tradition, the true Christian tradition.
That's right.
What do you mean by these rise of prophetic voices?
Well, again, I think we need to tease out the rich prophetic tradition of Christianity in America and in the making of America. That the major movements in this country, abolitionism, women's suffrage, trade union movement, civil rights movement, they all have been led by prophetic Christians, which means that prophetic Christianity has been a kind of leaven in the American loaf. If you think of figures like our dear sister Dorothy Day, who's a Catholic sister, a white brother, William Sloane Coffin, white Protestant, progressive, prophetic to the core, still alive, God bless it, right?
Berrigan brothers.
You got Daniel and Phil Berrigan, Catholic brothers. You got Ida B. Wells Barnett, Fannie Lou Hamer. These are Christian black sisters, right? That all of these are prophetic Christians. Walter Rauschenbusch, founder of the social gospel, right? White Baptist brother, right? That you have this rich prophetic tradition in Christianity that has helped make America more democratic and just and free and equal. But since Martin's death, there is the rise of what are called Constantinian Christians, who are well organized, well funded by corporate elites, and they targeted prophetic Christian institutions, you see. And of course, by Constantinian Christians, what I mean is those who build on those versions of Christianity that Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire, began to promulgate. And how ironic that the Roman Empire that put Jesus to death, the cross is the night side, the dark side of the Roman Empire. And there had been Roman elites who had callously killed so many Jewish leaders and figures and so forth. For them, Jesus was just another Jew to be killed, you see. And how ironic, though, that that same movement that would flow out of the precious life and death and resurrection of Jesus becomes incorporated into the empire that put him to death. And so Constantinian Christianity loses the prophetic fervor that takes us back to the blood at the cross and the empty tomb. And you get this schizophrenia that's going at it. In the history of Christianity, the Constantinian ones who sit comfortably at the table of imperial elites and downplay social justice, highlight individual piety, highlight individual conversion, and have very little to say about the ways in which the structures and institutions in our society actually scar and wound people, and Christians have a role of changing those institutions and structures. And prophetic Christians have always been contending with Constantinian Christians, and right now in America, if you were to walk up to someone and say, well, I'm a Christian, they think that means Constantinian Christian. They think that means whoever, you know, some deeply conservative, right-wing Christian brother or sister.
Militaristic,
pro-imperialistic, materialistic, and also narrowly, self-righteously moralistic, willing to impose one's own morality on others. You say, well, no, wait a minute, we've got Jewish brothers and sisters, we've got Buddhist brothers and sisters, we've got atheistic and agnostic brothers and sisters. They are fellow citizens who ought to be equal before the law. And we Christians, we're unashamed of the gospel, but we also recognize that the gospel recognizes us, wants us to be not just tolerant, but even respectful to others as children of God, even as we disagree with them. And unfortunately, Constantinian Christianity is choking a lot of the prophetic fervor out of our churches.
Yeah, and that's the you talk about that quite a bit in the book, particularly on that chapter. Where does the Constantinian Christian get its strength, get its influence? Is it because it allies itself with the economic and political and military power? Because it certainly doesn't get its strength out of the Gospels. You know, and as Christians, are we not to get our strength from what Jesus said and did? That to me is the crisis of the Christian identity that this program raises, and that you raise in this book. I begin the program, as you know, with the motto that the church could turn the world towards peace if the church lived and taught as Jesus lived and taught. And how do we get from the teachings of Jesus are so well documented and well known, and it's an incontrovertible tradition of compassion for the poor,
Absolutely.
of a willingness to and duty to serve and love all of humanity without condition, to give freely without expectation of return, and to love those who persecute you. Now, for how does a Constantinian Christian who nightly prays that to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, how does that Constantinian Christian develop and develop into an attitude where he supports the empire that Jesus so much wanted to face up against? Where does this Constantinian Christian develop that sense of?
That's a very important question. I think there's three things that stand in the way. I think there's a certain lack of exposure. I mean, there's so many fellow Christians in America who are simply not exposed to alternative understandings of the gospel, that they grow up in a context in which they're exposed to one version, a Constantinian version, and they really do believe that sometimes even the flag is over the cross and the cross over the flag. That's the kind of patriotism that subordinates the gospel to Americanism. So you end up with an Americanized Christianity. We know, of course, Jesus wasn't American.
He wasn't a Christian.
He was a Mediterranean Jewish brother who loved in such a way that his particular life and death and resurrection set in motion a whole new way of life and a way of struggle that had to do with love, compassion, forgiveness, sacrifice, service, stewardship, and so forth, you see. So that they attempt to tame that Jesus and domesticate that Jesus for American aims and purposes. That's one. The second, though, is just lack of courage, because it's true. You see that all Christians fall short. and that we really have to take the gospel very seriously to be free in that love and love in that freedom, you see. And that takes a courage. And most of our Constantinian fellow Christians, they're after a certain comfort and convenience and contentment. They don't understand that to be a Christian is to live dangerously. It's not to look for a certain kind of comfort and a certain kind of material blessing and a certain kind of stability. What Jesus promises us is to be with us. He doesn't promise us a life with no mountains. He doesn't even promise us that he'll remove the mountains. He promises us to be with us, to give us the strength to climb the mountains. But what the Americanized version is all about Disneyland, Disney World, Peter Pan. That's all about comfort, convenience, innocence, not having to struggle, not having to contest, not even having to suffer. And Jesus says, no, I don't promise that you're not going to suffer. I promise to be with you in your suffering. It's a very different kind of connection, you see. And so on the one hand, it's a lack of exposure. On the other hand, it's a lack of courage. And then there is the benefits. Because if you opt for the security, you opt for the comfort, then the empire comes in and lifts you up. Gives you big money, status, and a host of other things, you see. And those of us who are able to move inside of the system and see the status and the power and say, yes, we know it, it's there, but you know what? There's something much deeper, much richer. There's something that's worth living and dying for that's very different than what the empire has to offer. It's not just about power, status, prestige. It's about this blood at the cross. It's about this love. It's about this deep, deep, inexplicable love we can't even wrap our heads around. We can only see it partially, as Paul says in the New Testament, see. And in the end, that is the bottom line. To redefine that's
the security that we would have, and that's the promise for eternal life is to live with love and compassion.
And the old folk used to put it this way. They used to say, what's the matter of stepping out on nothing and landing on something, which is to say, they also say something the world didn't give you and the world didn't take away. That's precisely that leap of faith great Kierkegaard talks about. And it looks as if sometimes you may land on nothing because the world, these goods, securities, comforts, they can't come in. But then what happens? Boom. There's that everlasting arm that's there for you, you see. That's that blood pumping.
But our democracy suffers as a result of attitudes that speak only to materialism and to militarism.
Absolutely.
And to the narrowness and if we don't value people, if we don't value any human life, everywhere. We must value every life.
That's right. And across the board.
Across the board.
Across the board. A precious baby in Guatemala, in Argentina, in Ethiopia, in Iraq, in Russia, in Germany, in Tel Aviv, on the West Bank, or in Atlanta has the same value. Now, even saying that means you got to cut against the grain. Because so many fellow citizens really believe that in the eyes of God, an American baby has more value than a baby in South Africa. Or they may believe in the abstract, all babies have the same value. But when you look at how they behave and their priorities, those Christians who fundamentally believe that all babies have the same value, they're going to cut against the grain. They're going to radically cut against the grain. In the Middle East, if you really believe a Palestinian baby has exactly the same value as an Israeli baby, then you're going to end up with a slightly different, maybe very different public policy. You're going to say, we must have security for Israeli brothers and sisters because Jews have been a hated and despised people. And Christians have contributed greatly to Jewish suffering, anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism. At the same time, Palestinians are children of God. And that their babies have the same value, their cry for justice must be taken seriously. And in fact, in the end, there will be no security for Israel as long as you occupy and subjugate any people.
Right.
There would be no security for Palestinians if they subjugated Jews, if they subjugated Israelis. So how do you bring together and be pro-Christian, pro-justice in the Middle East and acknowledge the need for security of Israel and the need for justice of Palestinians, and begin to cast it in that way. Well, there you have a very different dialogue and debate. And, of course, that radically cuts against the grain in America.
Right.
They talk this way.
Yes.
You got to think out of the box.
And you've done that. I know your commitment, your work with Tikkun.
Yeah, with Brother Rabbi Michael Lerner, and of course Susanna Heschel, the daughter of the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Absolutely.
Yes, and that's very noble and important work, because that voice is a voice that is not heard. It's a voice that the Jewish voice for justice and compassion that was reflected in the prophets of Jeremiah and Amos.
Absolutely.
That type of prophetic voice is so suppressed, it's difficult to hear it.
It's true.
And it requires courage, the same type of courage that the Jew who went up to the cross and was nailed to be able to speak freely. That same type of courage needs to be heard in the Jewish community, because I think it's so. I'm sure you agree with me that so much of our trouble focuses down to this Israel-Palestinian issue that has been festering like a cancer for 50 years, 60 years.
And so much of the Islamic gangsterism and terrorism,
it plays off of it.
Plays off of the hypocrisy of the United States, both in relation to Saudi Arabia, supporting such an autocratic, monarchic, but oil-rich state, and the bias of U.S. foreign policy that does not take seriously Palestinian suffering and Palestinian babies.
Yes. It's a topic that and it's a voice that I appreciate very much. You and Rabbi Lerner and Susan being able to announce and to encourage, because I think it must be an encouraging voice, because so much of what's going on there is so wrong on both sides.
On both sides.
And it's a heartbreaking. It's a heartbreaking experience to live, to see, to experience. And I encourage that work, and I know how important it is to you. I do believe that at some point in time the prophetic voices will rise, and that there would be peace and justice in the Holy Land and in America.
And the good news is that younger generation is hungry. Younger generation is very thirsty for what we're talking about. They've seen through the material toys, they've seen through the hedonism, they've seen through the endless quest for pleasure, and they really, I mean, we've seen in New York City, right? You had 1,800 people arrested. That's the most people arrested at one time in the history of New York City. At the same time, you've got Muhammad Gandhi's grandson went to the Middle East, led a march. Disproportionately young people.
Yes.
Nonviolent, building on the legacy of Martin King and his great-grandfather in the Middle East. So some of these connections are being made. Once you start making those connections to the movement against sweatshops, so you begin to bring some power and pressure to bear on these corporate elites and all of the profit-making at the expense of ordinary working people and so forth. The Lord is still working, brother.
Doctor, thank you for connecting with us, and appreciate you being here. Thank you for coming. I want you to come on back.
No, but this show is salt of the earth, leaven in the loaf. Very important.
Thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Dr. West. I want you to seek peace, find peace, and be peace, and vote.